Everyone, Dr. Kuniak with a video lecture here. I had a request to go over the prompts associated with. I had a couple requests to go over the prompts associated with the final assignment, the article proposal, and so I am going to do that. I'm actually opening up the syllabus. I thought I had it open already. I'm opening up the syllabus as we speak. So let me get down to the appendices. And okay, so we're in Appendix B, and I am going to um, share this. Okay. So hopefully you are all able to see this. I'm gathering that the confusion comes from a couple of places, and so here's what we'll take a look at. So the draft article proposal that all of you submitted, that was just to make sure that you're heading in the right direction, the topic makes sense, you have an idea of how you're going to write this, all of that stuff. Very common. I know I had a couple folks message me to let me know they don't really like to write drafts, or they don't typically use outlines, and that's fine. Everybody has their preference. I use outlines a lot. I'm not That's not why that's in the assignment here. It's kind of fairly common for scholarly stuff for folks to request that, um, as part of the assignment. But I do use outlines. I've found them to be helpful. I used to try to um, just kind of write my articles from scratch. And then I think I shared this with all of you in a previous video lecture. I'm not, so I apologize if it's repetitive, but I think it's relevant. I had a professor who used to say that there is no such thing as good writers, only good editors. And I think there's probably both, but I've come to realize that what he said, there's some importance to that, and that good editing is kind of indispensable, and that I am a better editor oftentimes than I am a good writer. And what that's done is actually it's taken a lot of pressure off me. So I take some time. The first thing I do is draft out a rough outline of what I want to do, or what I think is going to make sense for the whatever it is that I'm supposed to write. And then I just keep kind of building off the outline. And then once I get enough notes into an outline, into a section of an outline, I start to fill those in. And essentially it's kind of corny to say, but because I can remember like a sixth grade teacher talking about this, but essentially the outline writes the paper for you is the idea. And then I do a lot of editing of the document. And so I try to make sure that there's this old expression that you should always edit. So if you edit a paper, give yourself at least a few hours before you look at it again. Like, go through, edit, make all your changes, then close it, or leave it open on your computer, but walk away. If you can, sleep on it. But even if not, a few hours away from it can clear your mind a little bit, and then do a fresh re-edit, and keep doing that until you don't change anything anymore. So every time you change something about the document, you need to do another edit. Now, we don't always have time for all of that, but I really do try, when my document is important, if I'm submitting it. I don't submit stuff for grades much anymore, but I would suggest for you, if you're submitting something for a grade, it's not a bad policy to make sure that you give yourself some time, a couple of days before it's due, to make sure you have time to edit it. I always give myself at least an extra week. Like, I try to set my deadline a week ahead of whatever is being requested of me. So like, if I know that there's a request for proposals out there, I try to be at least a week ahead of schedule, so that I give myself enough time to edit. So I'm not just submitting it and hoping for the best. It'll never be perfect. Nothing we write will ever be perfect, and you kind of get a feel for when it's good enough over time. But anyway, so I think a part of this is, the draft was important to get people thinking about stuff, so that you're not trying to write it cold. But let's take a look at the Appendix B descriptions here. So the introduction, in a standard article proposal, or in a standard article, there are roughly 5 sections. You have an introduction, a literature review, which is meant to be pretty bulky, a methods section, results, sometimes it's results and conclusions, and then a discussion section. And so that's kind of what you're looking at is introduction, literature review, method section, results and or conclusions, and sometimes conclusions and discussions are linked together. So that whole results, conclusions, discussions is somehow made into the parts 4 and 5, or 4, 5, and 6 if you want to break them apart. But 5 to 6 parts, however you look at this: introduction, literature review, methods, results, conclusions, discussions. So we're only in a proposal, and so this is the case if you're trying to get funding for something, if you're trying to, if you want a grant for travel, for completing a research. I've very rarely been lucky enough to get a substantial enough grant. I have gotten grants, but a substantial enough grant to cover all of my travel costs, but I've had some stuff deferred. They want a proposal first. This is also the case if you never intend to do scholarly research, and I've said this to a number of folks, because I know that's not what everyone's in a master's program for. I hope that clinicians, that yourself as practicing counselors, just like I for many, many, many years was exclusively a practicing counselor, I hope that you begin to feel comfortable with the idea of submitting to the literature. But even if you don't, even if that's never a thing that you do, if you have hopes of having your own practice, if you have hopes of working for an agency or finding a role in a county or state level mental health services or whatever the case may be, if you want something for your practice, you may be asked to submit a proposal. The counties, and maybe at some point I'll show you all this, the counties in Pennsylvania, for example, will have RFPs, requests for proposals, out all the time for, we have $200,000 in funding that we're sitting on. We want 6 drug and alcohol programs. So we'll accept, RFPs, requests for proposals, until December of whatever. And then they'll make a decision based on who submits the proposals, how many of those 6 that they get, if all are worthy of the money or whatever, and then they divide that up based on the proposals. Or maybe they have $200,000 for 6, so $200,000 for each of the 6, drug and alcohol centers, or whatever the case may be. There are requests for I get emails about requests for proposals all the time. I'm not in the business of doing that anymore, but that's a thing. And so you can get the seed money you need to start an agency or to work on a certain initiative, even like local community, I'm blanking on what they call it, community foundations will give mental health professionals and other social service workers money for things like new computers for your office or something like that, so that you don't have to put all the costs on yourself. But they're going to ask for a request for proposal. And even if it doesn't follow exactly the same format as what we're looking at here, the logic is the same that they're looking for. So this is helpful regardless, is my point. Don't just kind of wash this off as this is, Dr. Kuniak and the other faculty just making us do something because they do it. There are purposes for this. So anyway, let's take a look. So the introduction, the first section here, is literally to introduce and provide a framework for why are we even doing this. The introduction should sell to the reader a logical argument for why this research or service or whatever the case may be, why it needs to exist. So if you think about this, we aren't requiring an abstract for this. I know some folks either submitted an abstract or talked about it, and that's fine, but it's not required. I'm not grading on an abstract. But if you think about how these things break down, the abstract is for if I'm looking through an entire catalog or a series of search engines for articles, the abstract is a short paragraph of everything that's in that article. A few lines about the introduction, maybe a few citations, but not a lot of literature. And then what did we find? It's short, but I should be able to look at that and say, like, okay, this is one of the 100 or so articles I'm going to look at. The introduction lets me know more about, like, in longer form, what the rationale is for this. Like, why are we even looking into these variables? What's important about them? So that's your introduction section here, this section 1. When we move down to the literature reviews are meant to be longer. They're meant to be a bulk of the study, looking at everything we know so far, to sort of bolster that argument for why this study needs to be done, and share everything that we know so far, to support the idea that we need to take these next steps. So the literature review itself has sections to it. You don't have to list out all of these sections, and I'll tell you what I would suggest you utilize. But this is where, the introduction that you provided in your draft really should go to that section 1 introduction, the standalone introduction. And I made some comments about that on many people's papers. A lot of the comments that I made in the literature review bullets for folks, those get incorporated into, those are kind of my personalized notes for you based on your specific topic area, that get incorporated into these rubric sections that we're looking at here, this example section. So take the feedback I gave you and mesh it together with this. I was trying to give you stuff that I thought was going to be specifically helpful to your specific study that you're looking at. So the literature review itself is broken into its own 3 sections of an introduction, a main body, and conclusions. The introduction here, though repetitive, is essentially restating in a longer form with more supporting literature why we're doing this study in the first place. It should be a brief review of the overarching literature. So, like, for example, and I'm sorry, I'm just trying to draw on things that are in my head, but if I use my dissertation, which fits this model really well, off the top of my head, I was looking at variables of personality type, coping strategies, and resiliency level. So my introduction was about why I'm studying gamers, which was my thing in the first place, why I thought personality was an important variable to look at, why I thought coping strategies were important to look at, and why I thought resiliency was important to look at. Those in the overall literature review, if we look at the literature review as being, the goal is 3 to 5 pages roughly here. This introduction, the first introduction, separate of the literature review, should probably be about a page, or page and a half or so. The introduction and literature review here should be a page to 2 pages of content about, and I wouldn't go too much over 2 pages, because the main body is what should take the bulk of your time in this. But that should be so let's look at this again with some more detail. Why are each of these variables important for us to break down and understand for this study going forward? The main body is where you should take some time to talk about each of those variables. The main body is where more of your paper should, in my opinion, be, because in my example, I wrote several pages about everything we knew about personality and why we look at that and why that's important to mental health professionals. The same with coping strategies, the same with resiliency. Like, my main body was, out of my couple 100-page dissertation, was probably close to 80 pages or so itself, where I really dug deep into 80's probably too many. I'd have to take a look again, but it was a significant portion of the overall study, and a lot of that was like everything I could find that was relevant about personality, what we know, what we don't know, what people agree and disagree about, what we know and don't know, and all that about coping strategies, and the same with resiliency. And then I spent some time talking about the intersection of each of those, because there is literature that supports the idea that certain coping strategies are aligned with certain personality types, and coping methods can be predictive of the success with resiliency. So I had to spend some time talking about those intersections too. So that becomes the main body. So all those bits of feedback I gave you, all in different forms on your outline that were related to your variables, it's feedback on the main body section of your literature review for the most part. And then we should have a brief conclusion section that essentially restates what you expect the reader to have gotten out of this. You are the authors. What you expect. So you want to propose why this is important, give all the reasons to support why this is important, and then say, and so in conclusion, again, this is what you should have taken from this. That's the literature review. Don't leave it up to a question as to whether or not I'm following your logic. Tell me in the conclusion, what should I have taken away from this? So that's how that goes. Introduction, literature review, but broken into those sections, and then a discussion conclusion section here at the end. Normally, you would, in a proposal, you would include the methods section, but as I said to many of you, we're not having you do the study, so that seems like kind of a waste of time. Instead, this final conclusion section, which would typically go over what we learned from your study, if you did this, and connect that to the literature and tell us what made sense, what didn't make sense. Are you accepting or rejecting your hypotheses, things of that sort, and then go on to, and so now what do we need to look for in the future? This discussion and conclusion section is going to be more based on the process of you looking through all of this. And so it's basically saying, what did I gain from my literature review? What did I expect to find? What did I find? Was it essentially the same and reinforcing? Did I learn some new stuff about this? However you want to look at that. And that's the presentation of new concepts or positions. You're not actually doing a presentation for this. It's literally like how it appears. A presentation of new concepts or positions, review the presentation of new ideas if you came across those together based on discoveries and support of the literature review, and then a small discussion section that helps readers understand the information presented and discusses implications of for counseling professionals. So like, what could we use this for? And then what future research, provide suggestions for future research. What could we look at next? So like a lot of times when you do your study and when you're working through these sections, you have an idea, and this was the case for me. You have an idea about what you're asking and what you think is going to fit. But when you dig deep into the material, you may reshape your hypothesis a little bit because you had thought it was one thing, but then digging into the literature review, you realize, okay, well, and that's actually how I came up with the resiliency variable. I was just originally looking at personality and coping, but I was finding so much supporting literature that talked about coping and resiliency. My dissertation committee suggested, why don't you add that variable? You know, if you're seeing enough of these connections, let's not leave it to chance. Let's test it, make it a part of it. So now, after you've done this whole literature review, think about it. What's important? What would you change? What might you do? And not everything's going to fit for another study. There were aspects of my dissertation and then my follow-up study that I took out. Like I found out that there was not a strong correlation with coping strategies, at least in the methodology that I was using. So I dumped that for my follow-up study, but I brought in a lot of opinion related questions for my participants related to, would they share this information with another professional? That stuff I found out later. Like, and you can't do everything in one study. So it's, I have all of these ideas. What do I need to get to next? That goes into the discussion and conclusion section, which again should be 1 to 2 pages. So if you have 5 in here, for the literature review, 6, 7, maybe 8 for the discussion conclusion section, a page or so if it goes over a little, I understand, to get to this. Keep in mind that precision is important just as much as quantity, so don't go too far above the suggested page limits and things of that sort. Sometimes it comes down to deciding what needs to be in here and what doesn't. Again, that can be I found so much information on this, it would have made this study way too big. I would look at this next time, whatever that is. So those are my suggestions. That's my feedback. Hopefully this is helpful for folks and gives you kind of a larger understanding of the literature review and research process. And if you have any specific questions, reach out to me. Hope this video was helpful. Take care, everybody.